collegefootballnerds.com. Some of you Ohio State fans might know us as secfans.com, having a little bit of a rebrand here. We're casting a wider net. We heard a lot of feedback from y'all, especially Ohio State fans that said, I stayed away for a really long time because I thought you guys were homers, and then I finally watched one of your videos and I found out you were pretty objective. So we wanted to make sure that our branding didn't really kind of put us in a corner and keep people away from hearing what we had to say, especially since we are objective. And in this game, we've got no dog in the fight, no pun intended, Washington fans. Washington and Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. This is going to be a pretty good game, right? Good discussion, so we thought we should talk about it. Please remember, if you haven't already subscribed, hit that button, hit the like button, that helps us out too. But most of all, even more than subscribing, mix it up in the comments. Let us know what you think. Ohio State fans, don't tell us how you're just going to bomb Washington's defense and not back it up with any kind of data or numbers. And let's keep the trash talk to a minimum, but maybe a little bit, because that was kind of what makes this thing fun. All right, Josh, got a little bit of a contrast of styles here. Ohio State got a lot of flack for their defense this year, but then showed up against Michigan. I don't think about 30-plus points, but they were rolling in that game. So I think it was a good defensive performance. I actually didn't love their defense against Northwestern, but it looks like to this point, almost like Oklahoma, except their defense is clearly better than Oklahoma's. They're just going to score at will, and that's how they're going to bully people into a victory. And on the other side of the fence, we've got Washington, who really struggled in their conference championship game, got their points defensively, but they actually do play very good defense. So I don't think this is a fair comparison, because I do think that Washington is better than Northwestern, but Northwestern's a good defensive football team. They are not a great offensive football team. Is what we saw in the Big Ten Conference Championship game a preview of what we're going to see in this one?
I don't think so. I think what we're going to see in this game is a much more effective team on Washington's side of the ball than we saw from Northwestern when they were playing Ohio State. The Northwestern, you know, for what all they did throughout the season, and they were competitive and gave a number of ranked teams, you know, they played Notre Dame tough for a while, they played Michigan tough for a while. They're not a great team, and they weren't really, for most of the season, very good. S&P Plus, we use them a lot because they rank teams 1 through 130. We're not a slave to it. We don't think S&P is necessarily the be-all, end-all. It's a known objective metric we have no hand in. Northwestern is 80th in S&P Plus. So I think one of the main things you have to understand is Northwestern went 0-3 out of conference. 0-3 out of conference. They didn't play well for most of the year. They got a lot of credit because they managed to play low-scoring games against some big-name teams. And it seems like, to a certain extent, those teams, you know, particularly like Michigan, maybe struggled offensively once they get a certain amount of resistance. But Northwestern wasn't good. And so I think first you have to take a big grain of salt with Ohio State beating Northwestern badly. You know, we covered that game. We basically told everybody in that video, hey, you know, I know everybody's excited. We don't think that Northwestern's going to give Ohio State a game. So we weren't wrong on that. I mean, that game wasn't close. So that's kind of my first point is, one, you have to understand where Northwestern is. Even defensively, being a good defense, they're 32nd in S&P Plus. They are not by any means elite. Washington is a very, very, very good defense. They are third in S&P Plus. They have been almost dominant throughout the season in the Pac-12. Now, they've lost some games because they haven't been able to score consistently enough to where if the other team gets something going and gets points on the board, Washington struggles to keep pace. The Auburn game, to start the season, they really held Auburn's offense in check basically the entire game. They just couldn't convert in the red zone to actually score themselves and end up losing a game that they were statistically sort of probably should have won. And that's what you're facing in Washington. So it's definitely a strength-on-strength matchup here. I think this is probably one of the most underrated bowls nationally. Obviously, it's a big deal for Big Ten fans, big deal for fans for both of these teams. It's not getting as much respect as a lot of the other big games. Like, you know, we covered another video, Georgia, Texas. I think in many ways this game is a much better matchup than Georgia-Texas. And I do think Washington is very equipped to put up a fight against Ohio State's offense and make this a real game.
A lot of people are going to look at the 10-12 loss to Cal from Washington, which I think it's a fair criticism, just like the 29-point loss to Purdue is a fair criticism of Ohio State. I will say that without Myles Gaskin in that game, it really impacted their offense. And look, they gave up 12 points. They lost the game that they gave up 12 points. So I wonder, because I think he's, 2 years ago, Jake Browning probably, but this year, obviously, Gaskin is the heart and soul of this offense. And I do think Michigan fans killed me for this, but I wasn't huge on Karan Higdon all year, and I really wasn't huge on that Michigan offensive line. Washington has their holes in their offensive line, but it's better than Michigan's, and they have a better running back. And I think in this system, I think in general, they have a better I like Jake Browning more right now than I do Shea Patterson in that system. One of the things, as a sidebar, and I haven't had an opportunity to say this or talk about this, I'll talk about it now because I think it's relevant. The offensive game plan for Michigan was terrible against Ohio State. I was shocked at how basic and boring and tired and old that offense was and that approach was against Ohio State. I don't think Washington's going to do that. I think Michigan, they got their own problems. Washington's not going to do that here. So are they a little more equipped offensively to score on Ohio State, even though the last game we saw Washington, they weren't scoring a lot of points, than a Michigan might have been?
I think there's the potential for it just because the coaching staff is probably a little less stubborn. You have to remember this as Chris Peterson and his reputation at Boise State, and really throughout his career, for the most part, the guy's done a good job in bowl games. And it doesn't always translate every season, and I get that. But, last year they put up a heck of a fight against a very good Ohio State team in the bowl. The year before that, they had to play Alabama in the semifinals, which just really wasn't fair considering the 2016 Alabama defense was one of the better units in the past decade. But, go back to 2015, Southern Miss, 44-31. I think he's a good bowl coach. It hasn't really borne fruit because of the matchups they've had, but I think he is. I think they're going to do some things in this game to try to get Ohio State out of position. It's something that we talked about in the Ohio State-Michigan preview. Obviously, we got that game wrong, but we were kind of guessing that maybe Michigan would try to pull out some stops. There's all this talk from the Michigan camp about how they had all these plays hidden. One of the things we did kind of laugh about in our preview, you hear that all the time from people, right? That there's this whole second playbook that they haven't used because the team didn't need it. Unless your team is winning every game by 4 touchdowns, it's complete bull.
Yeah, you don't beat Northwestern 20-17 and keep some home run plays in your pocket.
Right. So it was crap. But Michigan bafflingly didn't really adjust, didn't really try to move their offense. I will say our projections and our models were not off for how much Michigan was going to score in that game. Let's see if I can find that. So we had Michigan scoring between 31 and 39 points. I had it scoring 31. The model had them scoring 39. And obviously they scored 39. So the model was dead on with how much Michigan was going to score against Ohio State. The problem really was that it wasn't Ohio State's defense that was the issue, or even, we talk about Michigan's offense. We knew Michigan's offense wasn't really equipped to go win in a shootout against Ohio State. The problem was Michigan's defense had a fundamental flaw where they were not capable of playing a spread offense that had a lot of speed and staying with them in man coverage. They just got killed by simple crossing routes, almost comical nature, and they had no real adjustment to it. They had no way to jam guys, and when they went to zone, they didn't know what they were doing, and it got even worse, and that game really ran away from them. Washington isn't going to have that problem, so I think Ohio State's kind of, I think Washington's going to kind of get theirs. I think they're going to be more effective than Michigan in terms of being able to outscore maybe their potential to a certain degree. But I think the bigger issue, it definitely is how much is good enough. If they can score 20 to 30 points, and Ohio State does not have a great defense this year, and I think every Ohio State fan at this point is willing to accept that fact. if they get 20 or 30 points, is that enough? Is 30 points enough for Washington? Because Washington has struggled to hit 30 all season. You know, they hit 35 against a really bad BYU team, 31 against UCLA, who's awful. They couldn't hit 30 against Colorado. Couldn't hit 30 against Oregon. Do they have to score 30 in this game? That's my question. Because if they do have to score more than 30, even with Ohio State's defensive problems, I think it's going to be really tough for Washington to hit that number. I think they can hit to the 20s and 30s. I think their offense is built to do that, but they're going to have to rely on trickeration and hit some big plays to get past that mark because they just haven't been able to generate that kind of offense organically all season.
I think one thing that's good for Washington in this case is one of their struggles is red zone offense has been a struggle this year. And Auburn, you know, we talk about time to prepare. They had a lot of time to prepare for Auburn, scored 16 points in that game, but probably could have scored 30 against a much better defense in Ohio State if they executed in the red zone. They were awful in the red zone in that game. I wonder if this comes down to they have a defense good enough to probably not give up a lot of huge plays, although I think you've got some explosion in the athletes on the Ohio State side that they're not going to be able to completely shut it down. If they can force Ohio State into a trading field goals for touchdown situation where Washington might have a lot of just stops because they don't have the offense to consistently drive the ball, but if they can drive the field and score in the red zone with touchdowns and hold Ohio State to field goals, that's got to be their strategy because I don't think they're going to shut down. As good as Washington's defense is, they're not going to shut down Ohio State's offense from getting first downs. They're not going to stop them from driving the ball. They have to, even though it's probably not in their DNA, I think they have to take almost a bend but don't break approach to avoid the deep shot, to avoid the home run, and hope you can hold them to a field goal in the red zone. Is that a fair strategy for them?
I think it is. I think what they've really got to do is just try to make sure everything stays in front of them and don't let Ohio State get easy plays. And I think they've been good at that. I really do think one of the biggest things in this game is you've got a Washington who's a Pac-12 team that's used to playing a lot of high-octane passing offenses on a week-in, week-out basis. And you can talk about how good the Pac-12 is or isn't, but the style of offense is a lot more similar to Ohio State than Ohio State's opponents were used to, if that makes sense. Michigan didn't play teams like Ohio State all year. And it was pretty obvious when you watched that game that Michigan probably was going to have real issues with anybody that ran that style of offense at a high level. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
And Washington is not going to be surprised at all by the style of offense that Ohio State plays. They might be surprised by the accuracy of the quarterback. They might be surprised by the speed and talent at receiver and the skill positions. They're not going to be surprised by the style. I think if Ohio State was a run-first team, I honestly think it might be more advantageous because that would be something that Washington wasn't used to seeing. But I think Washington, it gets a little bit of an edge in this game because they are kind of built to stop a team like Ohio State that isn't a phenomenal run team. They're not great running the ball, but they're a phenomenal passing offense. Washington is going to be able to kind of keep on top of things. They're not going to get out of position, and that leads to stops in the red zone because you don't give up easy plays.
I would kind of disagree with you on that, in that I would say it's more of a question mark than it is they're built to stop them because it's not a traditional Washington State style passing attack. It's an RPO attack, a little more. I know Dwayne Haskins isn't running the ball a lot, but it is a lot of motion, a lot of RPO, they're not lining up an air raid or pro style. There are some nuances there that Washington doesn't face as much in the Pac-12. There are some similar offenses in the Pac-12, but the ability to execute it and the type of offense they're going to see, I don't think they're entirely used to seeing it. So I think that's going to give them a little bit of a problem. But instead of talking about this too much more in theory, let's go to the ultimate in theory and take a look at the computer model and see what it says.
Right. So short version of this is, because a lot of you guys have heard our stuff before, our computer model looks at how you've done against your opponents, how your opponents did against everybody else, basically projects your production in this game. Based off that, it's all relational, how you did, how they did, and then how you match up against each other and where your strengths and weaknesses are. Based off how the production looks in this game, then it looks at your past history for each team and builds a unique scoring model. So Washington and Ohio State both have different scoring models for what they need to be successful and how much scoring output they're going to get based off the offensive production that's projected here. That's not just a linear points per yard kind of thing. It's way more nuanced than that. And for example, a lot of teams, LSU has to have a lot more. If LSU falls below a certain threshold with their offensive production, their offense craters. And so our model tends to track where teams shut down offensively versus where teams explode, that kind of thing. It also accounts for other stuff, to the extent that turnovers and non-offensive touchdowns create scoring, or the fact that special teams cost you points. To the extent it's predictable, it gets factored in. In this game, the first thing to note is a percentage of opponent averages allowed. So what that statistic tells you is if your opponent averages 5 yards per carry, you allow 4, you allow 80% of their average. It's a plain neutral statistic, but it gives you a better indicator of how good the defenses are relative to the teams they played. Washington is allowed right at 84 to 83% of both run and the pass. It's harder to keep teams from passing the ball really than it is running it. We see this all the time. That run number can get really low. Clemson's at 55% of opponent averages this year. Passing numbers never get that low. It's really, really, really hard to get that number below 75%. So basically, Washington is a good run defense. Not really a great one, but a good run defense. And 83% is a very good pass defense. Ohio State, unsurprisingly, is not good in this metric. 105% of opponent rushing averages, 104% of opponent passing averages. What that means is every team that plays Ohio State has done better than their average game statistically on offense on both sides of the ball. And to make matters worse, we consider 95% to really be average because everybody's numbers are inflated by playing weaker teams. Playing University of Nevada, Las Vegas, that kind of stuff inflates everybody's stats a little bit. So 105% is pretty rough. What does that all sort of turn out to? Well, Washington's expected to outgain Ohio State in this game, according to our model. 4.5 yards per carry, 8.8 yards per attempt. Ohio State's expected 3.6 yards per carry, 7.7 yards per attempt. It's important to remember Washington has a higher per carry average than Ohio State on offense to start with, so it's not really shocking. And as much as Ohio State's passing offense is more explosive, the gap is less than a yard. Washington averages 8.5 yards per attempt. Ohio State averages 9.3. However, Washington's defense is so much better than Ohio State's, it closes the gap and then some. The issue is, interestingly, even though Washington is expected to outgain Ohio State 6.4 yards per play to 5.7, Ohio State is expected to outscore Washington 31 to 26. And that gets into the fact, we hear this all the time, that our model doesn't take into account X, Y, Z, or D because we didn't mention it in the video. I can't mention every factor known to man. Our model does look at other stuff. And what it's telling you here is Ohio State does a better job of scoring than Washington. Ohio State's special teams are much better than Washington's. Washington's special teams are terrible. And because of that, Washington, even though they outgain Ohio State, this game, what our model is essentially telling you is this game is going to be a dogfight, but Ohio State gets some points in ways that give them enough of an edge to win despite it. Washington with, again, 35th ranked special teams for Ohio State, 118th rank in S&P special teams for Washington. That means Washington doesn't convert yardage into points, if you want to look at it that way, not quite so simplistic. And that's why it has Ohio State winning, even though it has Washington outgaining Ohio State.
I did not look at the model when we started talking about this, and a lot of times I have a score in my head. It's floating around, and then as we talk about some of these talking points that we have, and this is any video, not just this one, I generally will write down kind of my score prediction, and then I'll go and look at the model because you talk so long about the model every segment. I usually have plenty of time to digest all of it. My score was 31-26. I started out with 34-30, scratched it out, wrote down 31-26. So given that I wrote down the model score before I saw the model, and it's not worth lying about, so believe me or not, I'm going 31-26. I'm curious to see if you think that the model's got it right or if your score is going to be a lot different.
I do tend to agree with the model in this case for the most part. I think it's going to be a lower scoring game, honestly. I have this game 27-17. It's a blind guess. I think if this game runs away from somebody, in my view, it's clearly Ohio State that could run away from this game. Same caveat we gave in every other video. One, our model cannot really determine who's better between the Pac-12 and the Big Ten. The model kind of assumes the conferences are equal. And if a lot of people would sort of yell, are going to stamp their feet and yell at that point and say, well, how could you possibly do that? It's unfair. There's no way for any model to account for differences in conferences when the conferences don't have very many overlapping data points. The fact that Arizona State beat Michigan State, as it turns out, neither one of those teams is necessarily great. It didn't mean a whole heck of a lot. There's no real correlators, and other than me trying to manipulate the model, I can't adjust for it. So if there's an edge, it's Ohio State, basically due to the fact that their statistics aren't really fairly compared to that of Washington. But I do think this game is probably closer than a lot of people give it credit for. This isn't going to be what Ohio State faced in recent years, where they faced what I would consider to be really overmatched opponents that weren't able to handle their style. Washington is an inferior team to Ohio State talent-wise. Washington is well built to deal with Ohio State specifically. I think that's what keeps this game fairly close.
It is interesting, right, that the narrative is really, and I think it's based on how the two teams ended their season. Washington ended their season okay with Washington State and kind of ugly with Utah, and Ohio State just kind of romped. And part of Ohio State's romping was because of the poor matchups and not necessarily because Michigan is a bad team, but I do think Northwestern was a bit overrated. And Washington ended the season with a better opponent. I don't know, like you said, these conferences are so isolated. These are two conferences that play 9-game schedules, and they both have 4 or 5 teams in conference that don't play any Power 5 teams out of conference. So you do not have a ton of data here. It's really hard to see, and then you get into second and third level transitive property, and that data is worthless. So you said in the beginning of this discussion that this is one of the more interesting games, and I agree, because right now people are kind of down on the Pac-12 this year, and I think it's because they don't have any elite teams, but I think people are unfairly down on the Pac-12 in that, and what we saw in the first bowl game, Pac-12, Arizona State lost to, I think, Mountain West number 1. So Pac-12 number 8 or whatever lost to Mountain West number 1. And I was like, oh, look, Pac-12's overrated. They're not. We talk about them like every show, but Andrew Percival pointed out that Pac-12 is a lot better in metrics this year than the ACC. And they're not getting credit for it. So I think this is an opportunity for the Pac-12, even in a tight game here, if they lose, to sort of get some of that respect that they're honestly due this year and haven't gotten. So I think we should separate this, and I'll let you kind of talk about it too before we wind it down. I give all the 8-team, we got to have 8 teams expansion, crap. I give it a lot of heat, and I use Washington as an example because Washington went, lost 3 games to 3 unranked teams this year. I don't think that's a playoff worthy season, so I'd hate to see them auto bid in an 8-team situation. That doesn't mean the Pac-12 as a whole wasn't better than other Power 5 conferences. So is this an opportunity in your mind for the Pac-12 to sort of equalize, even if they don't win, to sort of equalize, or raise the perception of the conference overall?
It certainly is. Obviously, beating Ohio State, that was kind of red hot after the Michigan game. Honestly, it is a little odd how red hot Ohio State is perceived, given that they had a real struggle win against Maryland the week prior and the real struggle win against Nebraska 2 weeks prior to that. It's an opportunity for the Pac-12 to make a statement. To your point, I don't think the Pac-12 had a lot of truly elite teams this year, but they had a lot of good ones. And it's the opposite. You talked about the ACC, the opposite issue of the ACC. The ACC had Clemson, which everybody looks at, and they had Notre Dame's quasi-ACC, but we kind of throw that aside. If you took Clemson out of the ACC this year, they would have probably been an average group of 5 conference. There was no depth. There were not any good teams. Syracuse as a top 25 team in the rankings is a joke because it's built on the fact that there is nobody that is above average in that conference. Washington being a 3-loss team to a large degree is a result of the fact that there's a lot of parity in the Pac-12. And we talk about this all the time, so I don't want to belabor the point. Every conference goes 500 against itself every year. It doesn't matter if you're great or you're terrible. What really matters is how much parity you have. So if you have a lot of good teams that are all more or less equal, everybody goes 4-4. And at the end of the year, you look at that conference and you go, oh, they have all 8-win teams. They must suck. And it's the most ridiculous notion because all it meant was that the teams were all pretty balanced. They all, every average team in every conference goes 4-4, or 4.5 to 4.5 if you're in a 9-game conference schedule. If you've got a handful of 10-win teams in a conference, all that meant is that somebody else had to win 3 games to make that happen. Those wins and losses have to be distributed evenly. The Pac-12 just had a lot of parity this year. They had a lot of good teams. They didn't have elite teams. Probably shouldn't be in the playoff. I think that's fair, but it's a different discussion. And if I can I turn to one more point before we wrap this up, looking at our model? I think what's interesting in this matchup, again, our model, kind of similar to the Georgia-Texas game where we were dead on the over-under, it's kind of doing it again. So our model has this game and we don't look at the Vegas spread at all, by the way, when we make these models. They're usually not out yet when we make them, but we never reference them. We do the model the same way every week. Our model has Ohio State a 5-point favorite, and it has this game at 57 points. Ohio State in Vegas is a 6.5-point favorite, and the over-under is 58. So we're 1 point off the over-under. We're 1.5 points off the spread. So our model is really bang on with what Vegas is saying right now. And I think we probably got a little bit of respect, obviously with the Michigan game, but again, the Big Ten championship game, I want to give ourselves a pat on the back to give ourselves a little legitimacy. I had that 45-17. You had it 49-24. Both obviously in the ballpark. And I had Ohio State score and you had Northwestern score exactly right. Pac-12 game, we had a higher scoring. We were split on how that would go, but we both said that was going to be a high-scoring game. We both said it was going to be decided by a touchdown or less. So everything here sort of indicates the fact that this is going to be a close game. Our stuff, the point I'm making, our model is really consistent with what Vegas is telling you right now. This game could go sideways and we could be wrong, but I think everything we've said has been really, really realistic. We're not a slave to the numbers. We spent most of this video giving you a reason why we have this opinion and subjective reasons, but I think this is going to be a pretty tight and interesting game between two really good teams, where you have a sort of a strength on strength of Ohio State's offense versus Washington's defense. And of course, the thing that always decides the game in these strength on strength matchups is the other side of the ball. A lot of this is really going to depend on if Washington can score enough against Ohio State's defense.
All right, y'all, thanks for hanging with us this far into the season and now into the postseason. We want to remind you again, please subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot. We're also on Twitter at CFB Nerds. We'll link that in the description as well. And you can also check out collegefootballnerds.com. We have, we post kind of in blog style all of our videos and audio versions of this show, but also we have an NFL stats database where you can track kind of NFL who's wide receiver who's RBU. So we use NFL statistics, but they're searchable by college. So that's something that you might like. Anyway, reminder in the comments, let us know who's going to win the game, what's going to be the score. Keep your flamethrower packed away. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.